In Yiddishkeit, there's this idea of going to Kevarim, which means to pay respect at the gravesite of notable people, historic places, and people that are related to you. But in this video, I want to make this tradition my own. I want to tell you about some of my favorite cemeteries. In preparation for this, I've gone through my camera roll to look for photos of cemeteries, and oh boy, is there a lot of material. And you could really see all the moments that inspired my love for cemeteries. And so this week on Yiddishkeit, I want to tell you why it's actually cool to like cemeteries. If you're new to this channel, my name is David, and here on Yiddishkeit, we explore the experience of Jewishness. My experience of Jewishness is filtered through Jewish history, culture, and art. And to me, cemeteries is such a great way of capturing all three of these things, as I hope you'll see by the end of this video. So first off, let me tell you a little bit about the background of this tradition of Kevarim. I would say probably the most famous kever, definitely on social media, is the Rebbe's Ohel. This is the gravesite of a rabbi named Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was the seventh leader, the Rebbe of the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic movement, which is centered in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. But although I interact with people who are Chabad on a regular basis, I myself do not come from the Chabad community. As I mentioned previously on this channel, I come from the Yeshivish community in Flatbush, also in Brooklyn, but different type of Orthodox community. Because I'm from the yeshiva world, I don't have such an appreciation for the Rebbe's Ohel, but there was an emphasis on going to Kevarim, particularly when I was in Beis Medrash. Last week on the channel, I mentioned the experiences I had in third-year Beis Medrash, but today I want to tell you about a trip that we took in first-year Beis Medrash to Israel. As part of this trip, we went to several graves. In particular, we went to Kever David, which is the tomb of King David. Now, I was told that there's some dispute about whether this is the authentic burial place of the biblical character or not, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of debate and discussion. I'll be honest, I actually don't know much about this at all. I haven't looked into that particular piece of history and archaeology, so I don't know. I just know they brought us there and they're like, here's Kever David, pray. A similar example is Kever Rachel, which we went to as well. Now, as kids, we had these coloring pages of Kever Rachel, and it was like this beautiful structure with a dome middle of a field, and there's like this big tree overlooking it, but in reality it's not what it looks like. This dome structure is actually inside of like a bunker that the Israelis built around it, and you basically drive through that bunker and you go inside a building, and inside that building is the original dome structure that you can go to and pray. Another tomb that we went to was that of Reb Meir Baal Hanes. He was rabbi during the era of the Tanaim, and this is around the 1st or 2nd century. You could see people inside his tomb praying. You can see that it's actually has this interesting design inside, like a fold, and it has this Hebrew inscription on it, which says Elakah de Meir Aneni, the God of Meir, answer me, and it's supposed to invoke the merit of Rabbi Meir, and you will basically receive a salvation that you're asking for, that you're praying for at his gravesite. But what really captured my attention about his tomb was that outside, there's this area where you can see the Sea of Galilee, and there's this area where there's a bunch of candles which you light to invoke the memory of Rabbi Meir. And it was just like this giant mess, this huge like mumble jumble of candles and holders and wax and oil and water and fire, and oh my god, it was just like a big collage of candles and stuff. One final grave to mention that we visited in Israel was that of the Rambam, who's known as Maimonides. His name is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and there's this saying on his tomb and also on a nearby plaque, you can see it here, which says, Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam ki Moshe, which means from Moses in the Bible until Moses Maimonides, there was no one like them. Rambam is a very important figure in Jewish history because he wrote this work known as the Yad HaChazaka, which is this set of 14 volumes that cover the entire spectrum of Jewish ritual law. So though it was cool to visit the gravesite of some of the great sages and biblical figures, the truth is that the connection that I felt to that was minimal. It seemed very far away. I was in a foreign country. I've obviously studied works by them or about them, but it didn't feel personal to me. And as you probably know, this channel is all about making Jewishness personal. In fact, on this channel, we have a Jewish film club where we look at movies that depict Jewishness in depth, or we pick a topic about Jewishness and see how it's depicted in film. One thing that I noticed by watching dozens of movies about Jewishness is that the graveyard has become an icon of Jewishness on screen. Let me give you some examples. Recently, there was a movie called An American Pickle, which theme is all about processing grief. In particular, the main characters, Herschel and Ben, disagree and clash on how they want to actually process the loss of their family members.
But now we go to shul, say mourner's Kaddish, prayer for dead. Must properly honor memory of Sarah, Mort, your parents.
Herschel in particular wants to restore the actual cemetery and clean it up and make it look nice in order to honor the memory of those buried there. Another example of where the cemetery is front and center in a story, particularly about the grief and loss, is the movie Menashe, where, like Ben and Herschel, he finds this dynamic where he's trying to process the loss of his wife in a way that is different than what's expected by those around him. This theme carries over to a third movie called Loving Leia, where one of the opening scenes takes place at a funeral. And that movie also focuses on the idea of processing loss and finding one's own way in their Jewishness. But funerals and burial process is actually something that's featured prominently in film as well, most notably in Yentl, where her father passes away. She leads the funeral service over his grave.
Who will say Kaddish?
I will. It has to be a man, Yentl, a male relative.
Which obviously foreshadows the theme of the movie at large. And in Miller's Crossing, there's a moment where there is a prayer for the dead recited over a grave known as the Kaddish. The Kaddish is an interesting prayer which basically sanctifies God, but by reciting it in the memory of the deceased, it helps elevate their soul, and it's supposed to be a merit to their memory. Although in practice, you probably won't find people saying Kaddish unless there are 10 men present. There's also something known as the Yahrzeit, which is the anniversary day of someone's passing that is seen as an auspicious time to invoke their memory. This is a big part of the movie Menashe, as well as in the movie Brighton Beach Memoirs, where the main character Eugene and his family members go to visit the grave of his uncle. Another example of the Jewish grave being an iconic symbol in a movie is, of course, the Dybbuk. There's actually several different graves. First off, there's a grave in the center of the town that belongs to a young couple that was murdered while they were getting married. And so they were buried together in the center of town, and the tradition became that couples who were about to get married would go to this grave on the day of their wedding in order to invite the souls of these two young people who were cut down in this moment of happiness, to invite them to their happy day in order to celebrate with them. And you see that in the movie. And then later on, the main character, Leia, on the day of her wedding, goes to the grave of her mother in order to invite her soul to her wedding, which is a tradition that some Jewish communities keep, as well as going to the grave of the boy she was in love with, named Hanan, and inviting his soul to her wedding, which of course causes him to possess her, which is the title of the movie called The Dybbuk. Another example of possession is a more recent movie known as To Dust. It opens with this man losing his wife, and it showcases many of the rituals that are associated with that life cycle event. Also, the movie has this idea of possession where the main character Shmuel becomes obsessed with the body of his wife in her grave, and his children begin to think that he is possessed by the spirit of his late wife. And finally, the graveyard can be a place of closure. For example, in the movie's American Tale, it ends at the graveyard when Herschel and Ben finally reconcile. In Menashe, it's a place of contemplation where we see him find closure for his grief and move on and become a mensch. In Loving Leia, when Leia figures out her life, she comes back to the cemetery to reconcile with her late husband. And in the movie Everything is Illuminated, we actually get to see two parallel moments of closure in the graveyard. The Ukrainian characters get their moment, as well as the American character gets his moment with the grandfather he started the movie with. And there's a very similar moment in the movie Disobedience, where the main character, Ronit, before she leaves her childhood community, she takes a moment to find closure at the grave of her father. So hopefully at this point you can see how cemeteries, graveyards, burial sites, whatever you want to call them, play a huge role in Jewishness. But I want to focus more on the history of cemeteries. To start off historic cemeteries, let me tell you about probably the most famous one that I've visited, and that is Arlington National Cemetery. It is a very famous cemetery where a lot of veterans of war are buried. I actually visited the cemetery this past October. It's located right outside of Washington, D.C. You need to cross this bridge to go into the cemetery. What's really special about this cemetery is that all the gravestones look alike, and they are these little white gravestones that stick out, and they're in these neat rows. And so as you're driving by, we're on this little trolley driving by it, and you just see gravestone after gravestone. And I remember pulling out my phone and starting to film it, and just seeing on my phone just how all these gravestones are sliding by. And then I look up and I just see these lines of gravestones sliding by. And I look around, and no matter where I look, I just keep seeing this sea of white stones just moving by these neat lines. And also the space between them is also moving with you as you move. It's like this optical illusion. And it was this surreal, mesmerizing moment where it really hit me how many people had to sacrifice their life to preserve this country. A similar place in Arlington National Cemetery is known as the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. If someone was killed in action in a way that they can't be identified, but they know that they were missing or killed, they are honored by this memorial for all those that are unnamed. And there's actually an honor guard, someone that is standing at this tomb at all times to honor the memory of those who died. And it sits on this hill overlooking Washington, D.C., and you can basically see the entire city. And what's really special about that moment, about Arlington in general, is you realize that it's because of the sacrifices of the veterans, the people in that cemetery, that we get to have a city like Washington, D.C. We get to have a country like America. Another place that also evokes a very similar emotion is actually here in my hometown of Brooklyn. But before I tell you about that one, I want to just finish telling you notable things about Arlington. One of the notable people buried in Arlington is the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. What's interesting about his grave is that there is this torch with this fire that's always burning over his gravesite. And I'm not sure what exactly it represents, but I think it shows that his ideas, his fire, his spirit is still alive. It's still burning. On your way out of Arlington, they gave us a little flower, which is a poppy. It represented all those who were killed in World War I. It was evocative of this poem, which described this battlefield in France where there were all these dead bodies strewn across this field, but the poppies were beginning to bloom. And it's this really interesting mix of truly morbid, terrible, sad scene of death, but also this natural beauty that was coming forth, and this like intense clash of emotion. And that's what I think is so great about cemeteries, is that they're not one-dimensional places. They have so many elements to them. As we mentioned, there's the cultural elements, there's the personal element of ability to find closure, but there's also elements of history. Also, cemeteries are outside, so there's often a lot of beautiful nature and wildlife. And so this is why cemeteries are cool. They're able to interact with so many of our senses and evoke so many different emotions all at the same time. You get to feel reverence and gratitude and inspiration of the beauty of a cemetery all at the same time. So let me tell you about the best example of a cemetery that checks all of these boxes, and that is, of course, Greenwood Cemetery here in Brooklyn. It's quite an old cemetery. It's approaching 200 years old. It was opened in 1838, and it has these iconic arches which were put up in 1863 during the Civil War. This arch is made out of the beautiful brownstone that New York is iconic for. What initially caught my attention about Greenwood was the history of that area. You see, inside of Greenwood, there is this hill where a battle took place during the Revolutionary War in August of 1776. Brief history is that July 4th is, of course, Independence Day, when America declares its independence from Great Britain, but there needed to be a war that was fought over that, which begun at the end of August of 76. And this battle takes place right in my hometown of Brooklyn on what's today known as Battle Hill inside Greenwood Cemetery. So if you visit that place, It's actually the tallest natural point in Brooklyn, which is significant because it sits on what's known as a terminal moraine. It's a big pile of rocks that the glacier left at the end of the last ice age. So, just right there, you have a little bit of science as well. There's also this statue that is standing on the top of this hill, and it marks the memorial to this battle. The statue is holding a wreath. You can see how people leave little bric-a-brac, little tchotchkes in the wreath. There's also a Civil War monument on Battle Hill. This is me posing in front of it a couple years ago. And what's really cool about this hill, because it's so tall, it overlooks the New York Harbor, and you see a beautiful skyline of Manhattan. You also get to see the Statue of Liberty. And so this is just a taste of some of the beautiful history and science, some of the more nerdy elements of Greenwood Cemetery. And again, just like in Arlington, you see this idea of how the sacrifice that the soldiers made in the Continental Army on Battle Hill, and then you look around and you see the city kind of like sprouting forth in front of you. And to me, it always evoked this feeling of the sacrifices that these people made created the possibility for us to have this beautiful city that is sprawled out in front of me. And that spot on the top of Battle Hill always felt very, very special, almost sacred. In fact, I get this sense also when I visit the graves of my family members, particularly my grandparents on my father's side and my great grandparents on my mother's side. To me, when I visit, I think about how all four of them came from Soviet Union to the United States. When they passed on, they're buried here. And so I feel like I have a physical connection to this land. Let's focus on some of the other elements of Greenwood that also really stand out besides the history and nerdy stuff. And that is the beauty of nature. On the famous arch in the entrance to Greenwood is actually a nest that was built by parakeets. If you come in the spring and stand beneath the arch, you can see the green parakeets flying by you as they try to maintain their nest and rebuild it for the spring. It's quite an amazing experience standing there and just watching them whiz by you. It's crazy. Another bird that I spotted in Greenwood Cemetery a few times is the red-tailed hawk, which is also a bird that's really meaningful to me because I saw the documentary called The Legend of the Pale Male, which is about the return of red-tailed hawks to New York City. And so it's really cool to see one of these birds in real life, and seeing them fly around Greenwood was really an amazing experience. But besides the birds, the plants themselves, the flowers, the trees are gorgeous and really bring out the seasons of New York. Of course, in the spring times, you have the blossoms. Make sure to take your allergy medicine that day because otherwise you are going to die. The summertime, you have all these intense lush colors. Pink, the green is so intense and lush. And of course, there's no season like the best season, which is fall. Autumn sunsets bring out so many different colors. It brings out the pink, the orange, the yellow. Here's some photos I took over the years. Just incredible stuff. It brings out the color of these leaves like insane. And then there's winter. Here's some photos taken by my friend. Got these geese on the snow, got the arch in the background. Another element of Greenwood is the art. For example, the architecture is very intentional, and there's all sorts of classical and modern structures throughout the cemetery. For example, this photo of me standing on top of the hillside mausoleum, which is built into this hill, so you can kind of be on the top of it where there's these pyramid structures. One of the nicest structures in all of Greenwood is known as the chapel. It's this large building that usually houses art installations inside. One art installation in particular that was really amazing was this one. It was about letting go and processing grief. And it was this big box that had a light underneath it and these circular holes where you can roll up paper and stick it inside. And you can pull out other papers and read what other people wrote, but what they were trying to let go of. And obviously, you wouldn't know who they were. It was all anonymous. So it was this really interesting feeling of relating to other people's challenges. And of course, we have to mention the most classic art pieces in cemeteries, which are the statues. There are so many statues in Greenwood. Here are some of the photos I've taken over the years, some of my favorites. What's cool about Greenwood in particular is that they actually have tours and cultural events. In particular, they have movie screenings in the cemetery during summer nights. And I've been to that multiple times. It is so cool. Walking into Greenwood at night, you can see the arches all lit up, and then the mausoleums have these candles on the steps, and everything is just lit by candlelight, and you're watching this movie on this giant screen. It was truly an incredible experience. I want to move on and talk about other historic cemeteries that are here in Brooklyn that I visited. In particular, there's the cemetery on McDonald Avenue and Gravesend Road, known as the Van Sicklen Cemetery. This is a cemetery that stretches all the way back to colonial times. It was first put into use around the 1650s, and it remained very active through the 1800s and was put out of use in the 1990s. Examples of colonial cemeteries in Brooklyn all have to do with one man named Peter Stuyvesant. He was the governor of the colony, and in 1654, he ordered that there be churches built in Brooklyn, one called the Flatbush Dutch Reformed Church and one called the Flatlands Dutch Reformed Church, both of which have historic cemeteries that date back to the 1650s. The Flatbush Reformed Church is on Flatbush Avenue and Church Avenue, which is why that avenue is called that, because it's named after the church. The current building that we see today is the third iteration, built in 1798, and the Flatlands Reformed Church is also off of Flatbush Avenue on Kings Highway, also with the graveyard dating back to the 1650s, with the current church building being also the third iteration, built in 1848. Got some really nice shots with the shadows and the snow. It's quite haunting and quite beautiful. Just as a side note, another colonial era graveyard that I've been to is at Trinity Church, which has the grave of Alexander Hamilton, who was a founding father and revolutionary. The current building is also the third iteration, built in 1846, but the graveyard dates to the very end of the 1600s in 1698. Trinity Church sits at the end of Wall Street, which is a street that runs through the oldest part of New York City. In fact, when George Washington was inaugurated to be the first president of the United States, it was on Wall Street at Federal Hall, just down the street from Trinity Church. And you can see in this image that the second iteration of Trinity Church is in the background. But speaking of cemeteries that have to do with local history, and in particularly Jewishness, I grew up in Midwood, which has this cemetery known as Washington Cemetery on the border of Midwood and Bensonhurst. The cemetery was first opened in 1850. Here's a map of Brooklyn in 1852. You can see the cemetery shaded in green, but you'll notice that although there's some large roads running through this area, all the blocks that are there today are not there in 1852. In fact, you can see the little symbols of trees representing that that entire area was essentially a woodland, a forest, which is where the name Midwood comes from. The person who founded the cemetery was named James Arlington Bennett, and his grave is actually in the front area of Washington Cemetery. There's also this historic photo of Jewish people visiting their relatives on Erev Rosh Hashanah. This is the eve of the Jewish New Year, which is also an auspicious time to commemorate one's loved ones. This photo was taken in September of 1928. In fact, what's interesting about this cemetery is that all the plots were already sold out as of a few years ago. So there might still be some funeral services that take place, but the actual spaces are all sold. Which leads me to my final topic of this video that has to do with my love of cemeteries and Jewishness, and that is, of course, the oldest Jewish cemeteries of New York, which belong to Congregation Shearith Israel. Congregation Shearith Israel started in the early 1700s, but that community traces its roots to the very first Jews that arrived in America in 1654. There are 4 cemeteries belonging to Shearith Israel, 3 of them in Manhattan, and the 4th one on Long Island, right on the border between Brooklyn and Queens. I actually discovered the 3rd cemetery first, and it was totally by accident. I was just passing by it one night in January of 2020. As you can see in this photo, I read the plaque. I'm like, wait a second, why is there a Jewish cemetery in the middle of Manhattan? As part of my larger interest in Jewish history, this led me to researching the story of the cemeteries, and I really wanted to visit all 4 of them. I have visited the 1st and 2nd cemetery in the past. In fact, a few years ago, the 2nd cemetery was doing a restoration project, which I was able to see as they were doing it live. And I always wanted to go into the 4th cemetery, particularly to visit the grave of Emma Lazarus. She was a poet who lived in the 1800s. She's most famous for her poem, The New Colossus, which has the very recognizable line, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." I also really wanted to go inside of the 1st cemetery because it has the grave of a man named Rabbi Gershom Mendes Satius, He was the chazan, the person who led the services for Congregation Shearith Israel, as well as the functioning rabbi of the community. He was also a very vocal advocate of the American Revolution and was one of the people who attended Washington's inauguration. And so I'm excited to let you know that this past week, I leaned into my love of cemeteries and Jewish history, and I actually visited all 4 cemeteries. And that's because I'm making a video about the oldest Jewish burials in Manhattan, and I want to take you on a tour of these cemeteries and tell you why the cemeteries are important, who are the notable people that are buried there, and what they're known for. Here's a small taste of what you're going to see in this video. The 4th cemetery is open to the public, so you can go as well. You can see graves of many notable people in Jewish American history. To me, a special moment was reciting one of Emma Lazarus's poems over her grave. In fact, next to her grave, there's a plaque of the New Colossus poem, and that felt particularly special to me since her poetry has had a huge influence on the way that I see my own Jewishness. The 2nd and 3rd cemeteries are next to each other. In fact, the 2nd cemetery is quite close to Emma Lazarus's former home, and the restoration is finished now. There's a new wall and a new fence. What's really cool, and you'll see this in the video, is that people put little rocks to mark the fact that they pay attention to the cemetery and want to honor the memory of the people there. They put the little rocks on the gate around the cemetery, and so as you walk by, you just see all these little rocks, and of course I had to add one myself. And finally, I got to go into the 1st cemetery, not just outside, but into it, and also get a tour of the various graves there and some of the history of the cemetery from the shamus, the caretaker of the cemetery for Shearith Israel, Rabbi Zechariah Ettinger. Normally, the 1st cemetery is only open to the public once a year on Memorial Day, where there is a memorial service that's held for the Jewish soldiers in the Revolutionary War. The rest of the time, you need to go by appointment, and so I was able to go, but I'm also able to take all of you along with me into these historic cemeteries and to also get that very same tour from Rabbi Ettinger. Also, I got to recite a chapter of Tehillim over the gravesite of Gershom ben Sasius, which is something that I've dreamed of doing for so many years. In fact, walking into the cemetery and praying over his grave was surreal. I kept questioning myself, like, is this real? Like, could someone pinch me? Like, it can't be actually happening. Also, as I'm standing over his grave and I'm a few lines into the psalm, I realized, like, oh my God, this is the moment that I've been waiting for. I've been wanting to come here and pray over his grave for so long. So I decided to start that chapter over again and have the right intention. In Hebrew, the word is kavana. So yeah, the kavanah be hidden different over the grave of Rabbi Gershom ben Sasius. And so now it's time for the edit. I got to put all these videos together, chop it up, make it make sense, make it fun to watch. So that will take me a little bit of time. But in the meantime, if you're interested in Jewish history, culture, and art, then you, my friend, you're in the right place. My name is David, and welcome to Yiddishkeit.